I'm a 25-year-old woman, and until recently, I thought I was an only child. I grew up in a quiet suburb where everyone pretty much knew everyone. I've had a pretty straightforward life, went to school, got decent grades, and ended up in a comfortable job that pays the bills. I live alone in a cozy apartment, close enough to my parents but far enough to have my own space. Life was steady, if a bit boring. But that changed about a week ago. It started with an email. It was from a woman named Nora who claimed to be my twin sister. Now, I know how that sounds, it's straight out of a soap opera. But this was real, and she knew things about me that no stranger would know. My birth date, the town where I was born, even the name of the hospital. She wasn't vague or hesitant, either. Nora said she'd been looking for me for years, combing through adoption records, searching online, and finally, she managed to track me down. I won't lie, I thought it was a scam at first. Why would my parents have hidden something this big from me? But her words nagged at me. I went over her email several times, trying to poke holes in her story, find some signs she was lying. But nothing seemed off. She even offered to meet in public so I could feel safe. She'd send me a photo so I'd recognize her. Something about her tone. I don't know, it made me want to give her the benefit of the doubt. After a sleepless night, I finally agreed to meet her. We arranged to meet at a cafe a few towns over, where nobody would know us. It was one of those quiet places where nobody bothers you. I got there early, nervous as anything. I kept thinking, what if she really does look like me? And she did. The moment Nora walked in, it felt like looking into a mirror. Same hair color, similar build, even the way she carried herself. I felt this weird, instant connection, like something just clicked. It was almost too perfect to be true. But as surreal as it was, that moment erased any doubt I'd had. Nora was me in a way, but also someone completely different. Nora told me her story, starting from the beginning. She'd been adopted by a couple who'd raised her in a small town a few hours away. It wasn't a perfect family, she admitted, but she was loved. Yet, growing up, she always had this nagging feeling like she didn't quite fit. She said that when she was a teenager, she'd discovered she was adopted. From that day on, she was determined to find her biological family. She shared every detail she'd pieced together over the years, from tracking down her birth records to consulting public records and adoption forums. She said she had come across my birth information through some obscure records, and that's when everything started falling into place. She knew I existed. What she didn't understand was why she'd been given up, but I'd been kept, and she couldn't shake the feeling that our parents had known about her all along. It was then she mentioned something that made my stomach drop. Nora said she had once tried to reach out to my parents. She'd found a way to contact them, hoping for answers or at least acknowledgement, but they had never replied. She showed me the email she'd sent, all ignored. My mind raced. I could hardly believe my own parents could keep something like this from me, let alone ignore someone reaching out with such personal ties. By the time Nora finished talking, I felt like my head was spinning. There were so many unanswered questions. Why had my parents kept her a secret? Why hadn't they told me I had a twin sister? I couldn't understand it. Nora said she was prepared for me not to believe her or to be angry. She told me she wouldn't blame me if I chose to walk away. But I could tell she was just as confused as I was, and that she'd been carrying this weight alone for years. I wasn't sure what to feel, but I knew I couldn't just leave things like this. We sat in silence for a moment before Nora spoke up, suggesting that we confront my parents together. She figured if they wouldn't respond to her, maybe they'd have to answer if I was there. I could tell she was frustrated, even hurt, but she was trying to hold it together. Part of me felt it was too soon. I barely knew this woman, yet somehow she was my sister. I had a hard time processing that reality, let alone preparing to confront my parents. But I agreed. I told her I'd call my mom, just to see her reaction. Maybe I could gauge if there was any truth to Nora's story from my mom's response. So later that night, with Nora still nearby, I dialed my mom's number. I remember my hands were shaking, my heart pounding like a drum. When she picked up, I mentioned Nora's name casually, just testing the waters. There was a long silence, and then a strange, tight tone in her voice as she asked how I'd found out. That response alone confirmed everything. My mom was hiding something. She didn't deny Nora's existence or ask who I was talking about. Her first instinct was defense, not confusion. I ended the call as quickly as possible, telling her Nora wanted answers. I could hear the panic in her voice, the tension, and the urgency to brush this under the rug. That was the moment I knew there was no going back. Nora was here, and she was as real as I was. And my family had some explaining to do. So yeah, here I am, posting this because I honestly don't know where to go from here. I'm torn between shock and a strange kind of relief, like something that was always missing finally clicked into place. My life just took a sharp turn I never expected, and I need some advice. Update 1. After my awkward phone call with mom, I barely slept. Nora and I decided to give my parents a day to process the news, hoping they'd agree to meet. The next afternoon, I got a message from my dad, let's talk. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., no warmth, no reassurance, just instructions. When we showed up at my parents' place, the tension hit like a wall. Dad stood by the door, and he barely looked at Nora. Mom was already seated, her hands tightly folded in her lap, avoiding our eyes. Nora and I sat across from them, and it felt like the room was holding its breath. We started slow, just trying to ask simple questions. But every time Nora mentioned the adoption, my parents clammed up. Mom dodged, saying things like, it was a long time ago, or these decisions are complicated. Dad barely said anything, just kept glancing at the clock as if he had somewhere better to be. Nora, who'd been calm so far, finally snapped. She leaned forward, her voice strong, asking them directly why she'd been given up. That's when Dad finally spoke. He said they'd been going through financial difficulties when we were born. They couldn't afford to raise 2 kids. He made it sound almost logical, like Nora's adoption was a practical decision to ease their struggles. Nora just sat there, staring at him, and for a moment I thought she'd let it go. But then she looked at me, back at Dad, and shook her head. Nora pointed out that her adoptive family hadn't been well off either. If money was the main reason, why didn't they make sure she went to a more financially secure home? The room went silent. My parents had no answer. It was like they hadn't expected Nora to question the situation so deeply. They kept saying things about doing what was best at the time, but it all felt like half-truths. After a while, my mom finally spoke, her voice shaking a bit. She hinted that they'd been worried about what extended family would think. It was hard back then, she said, having twins when they could barely make ends meet. She admitted that some relatives had judged them harshly, and she let slip that keeping one child was easier to explain. Nora's expression shifted. She didn't raise her voice, but I could see the anger in her eyes. It wasn't just about money. They'd chosen a path that would protect their image, too. I watched as Nora's calm demeanor crumbled. She told my parents how she'd spent years wondering why she wasn't wanted, why she hadn't been enough. And the idea that they'd given her up for reasons tied to reputation and convenience, it hurt. The more we pushed, the more uncomfortable my parents became. Nora asked for her birth certificate and any documents related to the adoption. My mom hesitated, glancing at Dad, who shook his head and said those records were private and not necessary for her to see. That response only made Nora more frustrated. She insisted that as the person they'd put up for adoption, she had every right to know the truth. After that, the conversation went downhill fast. My dad stood up and said they'd need time to process before they could talk more about it. He ushered us toward the door, claiming they'd be in touch soon. The message was clear. The conversation was over, whether we liked it or not. We left feeling even more confused. My parents had given us just enough information to make us suspicious, but not enough to truly explain anything. It didn't sit right, and I could tell Nora was fuming. She needed answers, and I felt like I owed it to her to help get them. Back at my place, we tried to distract ourselves. Nora started poking around, looking at old photos I had out. That's when she paused, staring at a picture from my baby album. She pointed at a baby in the background who looked just like her, wearing a tiny bow in her hair. I had never noticed the resemblance before, but now it was obvious. If Nora had been put up for adoption right after birth, why did it look like she'd spent time in my early years? That little discovery made me feel like we were missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Nora and I stayed up late that night, trying to figure out what else could be going on. We scoured the internet, looking up local adoption laws and practices from when we were born. Some people on Reddit suggested searching for closed adoption records, so I made a list of places we could try for more information. It was a long shot, but we were desperate. Then, just as we were about to call it a night, Nora's phone rang. The call was from a number she didn't recognize. She picked up, and a woman on the other end introduced herself as Aunt Carol, claiming to be a distant relative. Nora put the call on speaker, and Aunt Carol explained that she'd heard about our search through some family connections. She didn't go into detail, but she said she had important information about our family and Nora's adoption. She wanted to meet in person, claiming she had things that needed to be explained in private. Nora and I looked at each other, unsure if we should trust her. But Aunt Carol's urgency was hard to ignore. She mentioned she'd kept a stack of letters and documents that might help us piece things together. When we hung up, Nora and I just sat in silence, each processing everything we'd learned and everything we still didn't know. My parents had avoided giving us real answers, and now this distant relative was reaching out, promising to fill in the blanks. It felt like the more we uncovered, the less we understood. This whole situation had started with a message from Nora, and now it felt like we'd stumbled into a maze of family secrets that went deeper than either of us could have imagined. One thing was clear, Nora's adoption wasn't as simple as my parents had made it sound, and whatever Aunt Carol had to say, it was likely to change everything. Update 2. The day after Aunt Carol's phone call, Nora and I arranged to meet her at a quiet cafe in the next town over. She sounded certain that she had answers, and honestly, I was desperate to know the truth. Carol was already seated when we arrived, a thin, elderly woman with sharp eyes that seemed to take everything in. When we sat down, she didn't waste time on small talk. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of yellowed papers tied with a faded ribbon, letters, documents, and old photographs. She explained that she'd kept these for years, unsure if they'd ever see the light of day. But once she heard we were looking for answers, she felt it was time to bring them out. Carol's first revelation caught us off guard. She explained that my parents weren't the only ones involved in Nora's adoption. Several family members, including aunts, uncles, and even grandparents, had known. In fact, they had all pressured my parents into making the decision. I stared at her, stunned. Nora looked like she was on the edge of saying something, but Carol continued before she could interrupt. According to Carol, there was an understanding among the family that keeping both of us would have been frowned upon. Our parents, struggling financially and already judged by extended family for their choices, were urged to give one of us up. Carol said it wasn't just about money but also cultural expectations. A few members of the family believed raising twins under such conditions would bring shame. Nora's adoption wasn't solely a decision made by our parents, it was practically orchestrated by the entire family. Carol's words sank in, and it felt like betrayal on a massive scale. We weren't dealing with a secret my parents alone had kept. This was bigger, so many people had known. Nora's face was unreadable, but I knew she was processing the same shock I was. She'd spent years wondering why she'd been given up, and now we were learning it wasn't just about our parents struggling to make ends meet. It was about everyone else's opinions and expectations. The idea that her life had been shaped by people she'd never even met was too much. Nora finally spoke, asking Carol why she hadn't stepped in or done something to stop it. Carol looked down, and I could see a flicker of guilt cross her face. She admitted she had tried, but the pressure from the rest of the family was overwhelming. Back then, she'd thought it would be better not to go against everyone else. She'd regretted it ever since. When Carol finished, she pushed the stack of letters toward us. She told us they were mostly correspondences from that time, detailing discussions and decisions made by different family members. Nora and I glanced through them, and my stomach churned with each new line. Our parents had mentioned finances, but some of these letters hinted at something more, a family inheritance that had specific conditions attached. Keeping both of us might have disqualified them from accessing some kind of trust fund or inheritance clause. It felt surreal. Nora was adopted, not because of love or concern for her well-being, but because our family had placed more value on their reputation and some financial gain. Nora sat there, frozen, as she realized her entire life had been dictated by a decision made to protect family appearances and money. At that point, we decided we had to confront my parents again, this time with Carol there as backup. They couldn't dodge our questions if someone who knew the truth was there. Carol agreed to join us, saying it was time they faced the reality of what they'd done. The next day, I called my parents and asked them to meet, mentioning Carol would be coming too. My mom's voice immediately tightened, and she accused Carol of stirring up the past. She insisted that some things were better left alone. When I tried to push, Dad took the phone and said they weren't interested in rehashing painful memories. Then he hung up. Frustrated, I turned to Reddit for advice. People shared stories of their own family secrets, giving me tips on how to dig deeper without my parents' cooperation. Many suggested looking into legal avenues for accessing sealed adoption records, while others advised me to gather as much evidence as possible before making drastic decisions. Nora and I decided to go through the documents more thoroughly, looking for any clues that could give us a clearer picture. In one of the letters, I found a specific mention of an inheritance clause. It stated that my parents would only qualify if they had a single, stable household. 2 children, especially twins, were seen as a burden that could disrupt that image. The inheritance angle explained a lot about their decision to adopt Nora out, and it left Nora and me speechless. Nora seemed shaken. For the first time, I saw her struggling with her sense of identity. She was wondering aloud if she even wanted to be part of a family that could make decisions like this. It was one thing to be given up due to financial hardship, but to learn that it was about money and family image, it was a whole different level of betrayal. The responses on Reddit gave us both a sense of community, though. So many people had gone through similar family secrets, and they encouraged us to keep digging and stay strong. I could tell it helped Nora a bit to know she wasn't alone, but the emotional toll was still heavy. At this point, we were both determined to get to the bottom of this, no matter how ugly the truth was. Aunt Carol's information had given us some clarity, but it also opened up a whole new set of questions. Why had no one spoken up over the years? How could so many people keep a secret that tore 2 lives apart? We still didn't have all the answers, but I was more motivated than ever to find them. The inheritance angle suggested this wasn't just about survival or hard times, it was a cold, calculated choice. Update 3. After everything Aunt Carol revealed, Nora and I agreed we needed one last meeting with my parents. We both felt it was time to confront them head-on. When I called to set up a meeting, I made it clear this was about getting answers. After a long pause, Dad finally agreed, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled. When we arrived, the tension was thick. Dad stood by the door, his expression guarded, while Mom sat on the couch, looking visibly uncomfortable. Nora and I took seats across from them, and nobody spoke for a moment. It was almost as if we were all waiting for someone to break the silence. Finally, I started by telling them that we knew about the involvement of extended family in Nora's adoption. My parents glanced at each other, and I could see their hesitation. Nora didn't waste any time. She asked directly about the inheritance. Her voice was steady, but her gaze was intense. Dad's face tightened. He said they had done what was best at the time, that the decision hadn't been easy. He admitted there had been an inheritance involved, but he tried to downplay it, saying it wasn't the only reason. However, the more Nora pressed, the clearer it became. There was a specific inheritance clause that required a single, stable household. Keeping both of us would have jeopardized that inheritance, so they'd chosen to keep one child and put Nora up for adoption. Nora's hands clenched as she listened. She asked why they hadn't told her any of this, why they'd made her feel unwanted. My mom's face crumpled, and she finally spoke. She said they hadn't wanted Nora to feel like she was just given away. She tried to explain that they had believed she'd find a better life in another family, but even she couldn't hide the pain in her voice. She admitted that, back then, they had felt helpless under pressure from extended family, and terrified of financial ruin. But it still didn't explain why they'd kept it all a secret for so long. Nora's frustration boiled over. She looked directly at them, saying they had chosen money over family, over her. Her voice was sharp, and for a second, even I was taken aback by the rawness of her words. My parents sat there, visibly shaken. They had no defense. Mom's face softened, and for the first time, I saw real regret there. She admitted she had felt trapped and had carried guilt for years. She confessed that she would lie awake at night, wondering what kind of life Nora was living, but she hadn't known how to approach it or fix it. Still, it felt like too little, too late. Nora didn't respond, she just looked away, her expression unreadable. As we sat there, the weight of everything began to settle on me. The betrayal, the lies, and the choices that had split our family apart. Part of me wanted to walk away, to cut ties and never look back. But then I looked at Nora and realized we had a chance to rebuild something. Even if it wasn't with our parents, I could tell she was thinking the same thing. We were about to leave when I remembered the old documents Aunt Carol had given us. I pulled out a copy of my birth certificate and pointed to my middle name. It was Nora's birth name. I asked my parents why they'd kept her name as part of mine if they'd planned to give her up. Mom looked startled, and she admitted that it had been her way of holding on to Nora, a silent connection. It was strange, a small gesture that felt hollow now, but it explained a lot. Nora looked at me, Her eyes softened, and in that moment, it felt like we both made a decision without saying a word. We were going to stick together, regardless of our parents' choices. We had our own family now, even if it was just the two of us. As we were getting ready to leave, Mom tried to apologize. She said she was sorry for the pain they'd caused, but it felt forced, like an obligation. Nora didn't respond, and neither did I. The apology wasn't enough to erase what had happened. Nora then mentioned she was planning to reach out to other family members to learn more about her background, and that's when Dad got defensive, insisting that stirring up the past would only lead to more pain. It was clear they didn't want her digging any further, but she had already made up her mind. Aunt Carol continued to be a source of support for us. She shared more stories about our early years, and she even remembered little details about our family history that we'd never known. It was strange hearing things from someone who actually cared about what happened to Nora, who felt regret for her part in the situation. Carol encouraged Nora to keep looking for the truth, even if it meant more difficult conversations with family. Nora and I decided to look into the possibility of accessing sealed adoption records. It wasn't easy, and we knew it would take time, but we were determined. We had a few initial consultations with legal professionals to explore our options, and they were cautiously optimistic about our chances. I shared another post on Reddit, updating everyone on our situation and asking for advice. The responses flooded in, filled with empathy, anger on Nora's behalf, and stories of similar family secrets. People shared resources and legal advice, giving us the sense that we weren't alone. It helped, knowing so many people understood. As Nora and I walked out of my parents' house that day, I felt an odd mix of relief and sadness. We had the answers we'd come for, but it came with a price. Our relationship with our parents would never be the same. But Nora and I, we had each other now, and that was something worth holding on to. We didn't have all the answers yet, but we were closer. And for now, that was enough. Update 4. Months have passed since that final meeting with my parents, and Nora and I have been navigating life in a way I'd never imagined. After uncovering the inheritance truth and our family's hidden motivations, we chose to focus on our own healing rather than the painful past. Instead of seeking more explanations from our parents, Nora and I decided to move forward together, creating the family we had always deserved. Nora and I started meeting every weekend, getting to know each other not just as siblings but as friends. We'd spend hours talking over coffee, or sometimes just walking through the nearby park, finding comfort in each other's presence. The bond we were building felt natural, like it had always been waiting to surface. Those moments gave us a sense of belonging neither of us had felt in a long time. Not long after our decision to move on, Nora finally received access to her sealed adoption records. She'd applied for them as soon as we learned about her adoption's deeper motives, and with some legal help, she was able to get them sooner than we expected. Together, we sat down to open the file. Inside were documents that confirmed everything we already knew, but also included additional details on her birth and early days, names of people involved, and even notes from social workers. It was surreal seeing her life outlined in official papers, but it provided Nora a strange sense of closure. For the first time, she had concrete answers about her past. Word of Nora's reappearance must have spread among our relatives because soon after, we began receiving messages from extended family members we'd rarely heard from. Surprisingly, some reached out with genuine support and curiosity. A few even apologized for their role in our family's decisions, saying they'd only followed what the older generation had wanted. While the apologies didn't erase the hurt, they gave Nora and me a new perspective. It wasn't everyone against us. Some family members had regretted staying silent, and for the first time we started to feel a small sense of community within our extended family. The support from family and friends helped us as we both decided to begin therapy. Sorting through years of family secrecy wasn't easy, and neither of us wanted to carry that emotional weight alone. Therapy sessions allowed us to process everything without judgment, and each week, it felt like we were shedding layers of resentment and confusion. We'd meet after our sessions to share insights and laugh about the weird things that came up in therapy, a habit that became an unexpected source of comfort. Slowly, we started feeling lighter, more at peace. With this newfound stability, Nora began connecting with my friends, and they welcomed her with open arms. She quickly became a beloved addition to my social circle, joining us for dinners and weekend outings. It felt like she'd always been part of my life. One of my closest friends mentioned how natural it seemed, almost as if Nora had been missing all these years, and was finally where she belonged. Seeing her laugh and enjoy these simple moments made me realize just how much of a family we'd become. Eventually, I reached out to my parents one last time. This wasn't a plea for reconciliation, but more of a goodbye. I explained that Nora and I needed space and that I couldn't continue a relationship where secrets and half-truths lingered. It was an emotional conversation, but it ended with a clear boundary that I hoped they'd respect. My parents tried to express regret, but at that moment, it felt more like closure than anything else. After I hung up, I felt a sense of relief. Nora and I had our own family now, and it didn't require their approval. A few weeks later, Nora and I were invited to a small family gathering by one of the aunts who had reached out. We were cautious but agreed to go, unsure of what to expect. To our surprise, the gathering was warm and welcoming. Several relatives took time to speak with Nora, asking her questions, showing her old family photos, and genuinely embracing her. There was no judgment, no lingering resentment, just acceptance. For Nora, it was a revelation. She finally felt like she fit into a family that had once cast her out. With our family drama finally settled, Nora and I decided to celebrate by planning a sibling vacation. We'd both been talking about wanting to explore a new place together, free from the heavy weight of our family's past. We picked a destination that felt relaxing, somewhere with beaches and warm sun. We spent hours planning our itinerary, laughing over places we'd go and things we'd see. It felt surreal, like the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. This trip wasn't just about travel, it was a way for us to celebrate the family we'd chosen to be. As we prepared for the vacation, I found myself reflecting on everything. Nora's unexpected arrival had uprooted my life in ways I couldn't have predicted, but it was the best disruption I could have asked for. She'd filled a void I hadn't even realized was there, and together we'd created a bond that was stronger than anything my parents' decisions could destroy. I posted one final update on Reddit, thanking everyone who'd been following our story. The messages of support, advice, and shared experiences had been a lifeline for both Nora and me. Reading through people's comments helped me understand we weren't alone, and that meant more than I could ever explain. In the end, Nora and I found a family in each other, a relationship built on truth, not on secrets or inherited obligations. We looked forward to a future of our own making, one that wasn't defined by the choices of others. This journey, however unexpected, brought us to exactly where we needed to be, together, choosing a path forward on our terms. As we closed our laptops and continued planning our trip, Nora turned to me with a smile, and in that moment, I knew we'd be all right. Our past might have been tangled with lies, but our future was ours to create, and we were ready for it. Update 5. Nora and I have come a long way since that first, surprising email. We've spent months putting the pieces of our lives together, and after all the intense reunions, revelations, and family drama, it feels like we're finally stepping into a future we're creating together. Our lives no longer revolve around uncovering secrets or waiting for apologies. Now it's about creating our own traditions and choosing what family means to us. Nora and I started with the little things. We'd never had the chance to celebrate birthdays or holidays together, so we planned a small gathering around our shared birthday. We wanted it to feel special, inviting close friends and the few family members who'd supported us through everything. We kept it simple, a backyard barbecue with good food, music, and everyone we loved. Aunt Carol even showed up, bringing a box of childhood photos that she'd managed to save over the years. Seeing those old snapshots, including some with Nora as a baby, brought a sense of completeness to the night. In the middle of all this newfound joy, an unexpected letter arrived in the mail. It was a handwritten note from my parents. They hadn't tried to reach out since our last conversation, so seeing their handwriting was a surprise. The note was long and apologetic, admitting the mistakes they'd made and how they'd prioritized finances over family. They wrote about their regrets, the missed opportunities, and how they hoped Nora and I could forgive them someday. The apology was heartfelt, but it felt like a case of too little, too late. After reading it, I could tell Nora was torn, and honestly, I was too. We'd spent so much time trying to get closure, and while their apology was something we never expected, it didn't erase the years of secrecy and choices they'd made. I decided to respond, keeping it short but clear. I told them I appreciated their words and understood their regrets, but Nora and I were focused on moving forward with our own lives now. I let them know we forgave them, but explained we were prioritizing our relationship with each other. As Nora read my response, I could see a shift in her. She finally looked peaceful, no longer carrying the weight of her past. For the first time, she wasn't haunted by questions about her adoption or her place in our family. She'd found stability, and it showed in the way she carried herself and how easily she connected with everyone around her. We continued therapy together, a commitment we'd made to ensure our emotional health didn't suffer from our complicated family history. Each session allowed us to dig a little deeper, to unpack not only our shared trauma, but also the layers of resentment and fear we both had carried. Therapy became a safe space where we could confront our struggles and make sure we didn't carry unresolved anger into other parts of our lives. With each week, our sense of self grew stronger. Nora was finally at ease with her story, able to accept that her adoption wasn't a reflection of her worth but rather a decision beyond her control. For me, meeting Nora had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I felt a sense of growth, an emotional depth that made me more aware of the family dynamics I wanted to foster. Together, we decided to break the cycle of secrecy that had defined our family for so long, committing to openness and honesty in our relationship. Reddit continued to be a source of support and advice. Sharing our journey online was more helpful than I'd imagined. Strangers who'd been through similar experiences reached out, encouraging us to stay strong and reminding us that family isn't always defined by blood. It felt validating to hear from others who'd been in our shoes, and it was a reminder that we weren't alone. As our relationship deepened, Nora and I decided to limit contact with our parents. We'd forgiven them, but the boundaries were necessary for our well-being. Instead of clinging to a version of family that hurt us, we were choosing to protect our peace. We'd touch base with them occasionally, but we kept our distance, knowing that we couldn't let their choices affect our mental health. One day, Nora received unexpected news. Her adoptive family, who had always been somewhat distant, reached out, inviting us both to connect. It was something Nora had longed for, a chance to reconnect with the family who'd raised her, on new terms. We decided to meet with them, and it was a healing experience for Nora. Her adoptive family was open, welcoming, and genuinely supportive. It added a layer of closure, helping Nora to reconcile both sides of her family story. Reflecting on the journey, I realized how much we'd both grown. Meeting Nora had been the beginning of a transformation I never saw coming. She had helped me redefine what family meant and taught me that we have the power to choose the relationships we nurture. The challenges we'd faced together had reshaped our lives for the better, and I found myself grateful for the unplanned twist that brought us together. I shared a final update on Reddit, thanking everyone for their support. The encouragement, shared stories, and kindness from strangers had carried us through some of our darkest moments. I explained how Nora and I had chosen each other as family, letting go of the painful past and embracing a future on our terms. Writing that post felt like closing a chapter, a way to let go and move forward. Nora and I talked about creating a family genealogy project together, a way to document our unique story and preserve it for future generations. We wanted to remember this journey, not only for ourselves but also as a legacy of resilience and chosen family. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Our path wasn't easy, but it brought us exactly where we needed to be, together, empowered, and at peace with our past. With Nora by my side, I feel ready for whatever the future holds. We've learned that family isn't always who you're born with, it's who stands by you when everything else falls apart.